Hello, Miss Miller's class. Today we're going to finish The Tiger Rising. Chapter 22. "You're out in the woods with that girl again?" his father asked as soon as Rob stepped into the room. "Yes, sir," said Rob. "Look over here, son." His father was standing by Rob's bed. "Sir?" said Rob. His heart sank. He knew what his father had found: the meat. He had hidden it under his bed until it was time to go and feed the tiger again. "Where'd this meat come from?" his father asked, pointing to the bloody brown bag. Without thinking, Rob said, "Bucamp." "Bucamp," his father repeated, low and dark. "Bucamp? He don't hardly pay me enough to get by, and now he's giving us rotten meat. He thinks I ain't man enough to put meat on my own table?" Rob wanted to say something, but then he thought of Bucamp and held his tongue. "I ought to teach him a lesson," his father said. The cords in his neck stood out like twigs. He kicked the bag of meat. "I ought to," he said, "making me work for less than nothing, giving us rotten meat." He went and stood in front of his gun case. He didn't unlock it. He just stood and stared and cracked his knuckles. "Daddy," said Rob, but he couldn't think of anything to say after that. His mother would have known how to calm his father. She would have put her hand on his arm, or say his name in a soft, reproachful voice, and that would be enough. But Rob didn't know how to do those things. He stood for a minute more, and then he walked over to his bed and grabbed a piece of wood and his knife. Excuse me. As he left the room, his father was still standing at the locked gun case, staring through the glass at the deer hunting rifle, as if he was trying to will the gun into his hands. Rob walked to the Kentucky Star sign. He sat down underneath it and leaned up against one of the cold, damp poles and started to work on the wood. But his head was too full of his father's anger and Sistine's tears. He couldn't concentrate. He looked up at the dark underside of the sign and recalled lying on a blanket staring up at a big oak tree. His mother had been on one side of him, and his father, asleep and snoring, had been on the other. He remembered that his mother had taken hold of his hand and pointed up to the sun shining through the leaves of the trees. "Look, Rob, I have never in my life seen a prettier color green. Ain't it perfect?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, staring at the leaves. "It looks like the original green, the first one God ever thought up." His mother squeezed his hand hard. "That's right," she said. "The first one God ever thought up, the first ever green. You and me, we see the world sing." He concentrated on the green. He let it seep through a crack in his suitcase of not thoughts and fill up his head with the color. He wondered if Willie Mae's cricket had been the same bright original green. That's what he thought about as he carved, and so he wasn't surprised when he stopped and held the wood away from himself to see a wing and a beak and a tiny eye. It was Cricket, Willie Mae's cricket come to life under his knife. He worked on the bird for a long time until it looked so real that he half expected it to break into song. When he finally went back to the room, he found his father asleep in the recliner. The gun case was still locked and the bag of meat was gone. He wouldn't be able to feed the tiger in the morning. He would have to wait until Bucamp brought him another package. Rob went and stood over his father and stared down at him. He looked at his heavy hands and the bald spot on his nodding head. He was memorizing him and trying at the same time to understand him, to make some sense out of him, out of his anger and his quiet, comparing it to the way he used to sing and smile when his father jerked awake. Hey, he said. Hey, Rob said back. What time is it? I ain't sure, Rob said. Late, I guess. His father sighed. Go on and get me that leg medicine. Rob brought him the tube of medicine. Outside the motel room, the world creaked inside. The rain started in again, and his father's hands were gentle as he applied the ointment to Rob's legs. Chapter 23. The next morning, Rob put the keys to the tiger cage in one pocket and the wooden bird in the other and set out looking for Willie Mae. He found her in the laundry room, sitting on one of the fold-up chairs, smoking a cigarette and staring into space. Hey there, she said to him. Where's your lady friend? School, said Rob, but today's only a half day. He kept his hands in his pocket. Now that he stood before Willie Mae, he was afraid to give her the bird. What if it was wrong? What if he carved it wrong, and it didn't look anything like the real cricket? What you giving me them shifty eye looks for, Willie Mae said. I made you something, said Rob quickly, before he lost his nerve. Made me something, said Willie Mae. For real? Uh-huh. Close your eyes and hold out your hand. I ain't, said Willie Mae, but she smiled and closed her eyes and put out her enormous hand, palm up. Rob carefully placed the bird in it. You can look now, he told her. She closed her fingers around the little piece of wood, but she didn't open her eyes. She puffed on her cigarette. The long gray ash on the end of it trembled. Don't need to look, she finally said. The cigarette ash dropped on the floor. I know what I got in my hand. It's cricket. But you gotta look and tell me did I do it right, said Bob. Ain't gotta do nothing, said Willie Mae, except stay black and die. She opened her eyes slowly, as if she was afraid she might frighten the bird into flying away. This the right bird, she said, nodding her head. This the one. Now, you don't got to dream about him no more, said Rob. That's right, said Willie Mae. Where'd you learn to work a piece of wood like this? My mama, said Rob. She taught you good. Yes, ma'am, Rob said. He stared down at his legs. I know a wooden bird isn't the same as having a real one. It ain't, agreed Willie Mae, but it soothes my heart just the same. My dad said he ain't got no jobs for me until this afternoon. He said I could help you out this morning. Well, said Willie Mae. She dropped the bird into the front pocket of her dress. I might could find some way for you to help me. So Rob spent his morning following Willie Mae from room to room, stripping the dirty sheets from the beds. And while he worked, the keys jingled in his pocket, and he knew that soon Sistine would be out of school and that she would demand again that he unlock the cage and let the tiger go. Chapter 24. Where's Willie Mae? Sistine asked him as soon as she stepped off the bus. She was wearing a bright orange dress with pink circles all over it. Her left knee was skinned and bleeding. Her right eye was swollen. Huh? Said Rob. He stood and stared at her and wondered how she could get into so many fights in half a day of school. Willie Mae, said Sistine. Where is she? She's vacuuming, said Rob. Sistine started walking purposely towards the Kentucky Star. She talked to Rob without looking back. My mother found out I was wearing your clothes to school, she said. She took them away from me. I'm in trouble. I'm not supposed to come out here anymore. You know, you don't always got to get in fights. Sometimes, if you don't hit them back, they'll leave you alone. She whirled around and faced him. I want to get in fights, she said fiercely. I want to hit them back. Sometimes I hit them first. Oh, said Rob. She turned back around. I'm going to find Willie Mae, she said loudly. I'm going to ask her, what we should do about the tiger. You can't ask her about the tiger, said Rob. Bucamp said I ain't supposed to tell nobody, especially not Willie Mae. Sistine didn't answer him. She started to run, and Rob, to keep up with her, ran too. They found Willie Mae vacuuming the shag carpet in room 203. Sistine went up behind her and tapped her on the back. Willie Mae whirled around with her fist clenched, like a boxer. We need some answers, Sistine shouted over the roar of the vacuum cleaner. Willie Mae bent down and turned the vacuum cleaner off. Well, she said, look who's here. She kept her hand balled up as if she was still searching for someone to hit. What's in your hand? Sistine said. Willie Mae uncurled her fist and showed Sistine the bird. Oh, said Sistine. Rob realized then why he liked Sistine so much. He liked her because when she saw something beautiful, the sound of her voice changed. All the words she uttered had an oof sound to them, as if she was getting punched in the stomach. The sound was in her voice when she talked about the Sistine Chapel, and when she looked at things he'd carved in wood. It was there when she said the poem about the tiger burning bright, and it was there when she talked about Willie Mae. Her words sounded the way all those things made him feel, as if the world, the real world, had been punched through, so that he could see something wonderful and dazzling on the other side. Did Rob make that? Sistine asked Willie Mae. He did, said Willie Mae. It looks alive. Is it like the bird that you let go? Just about exactly, said Willie Mae. Said Sistine. She looked at Willie Mae. Then she turned and looked at Rob. She said, we need to ask you something. Ask on, said Willie Mae. If you know about something that was locked up in a cage, something big and beautiful that was locked away unfairly for no good reason, and you had the keys to the cage, would you let it go? Willie Mae sat down on the bed. A cloud of dust rose around her. Good Lord, she said. What you two children got in a cage? It's the tiger, Rob said. He felt like he had to be the one who said it. He was the one that found the tiger. He was the one that had the keys to the cage. A what? Said Willie Mae. A tiger, said Sistine. Do Jesus, claimed Willie Mae. It's true, said Sistine. Willie Mae shook her head. She looked up at the ceiling. She let out her breath in a long, slow hiss of disapproval. All right, she said. Why don't you all show me where you got this tiger locked up in a cage? Chapter 25. The three of them walked through the woods in silence. Sistine and Rob chewed 8-ball gum, and Willie Mae smoked a cigarette, and nobody said a word. Good Lord, said Willie Mae when they came up to the cage. She stared at the pacing animal. Ain't no reason to doubt the fierceness of God when he makes something like this, she said. Who was the fool that caged this tiger up? He belongs to Bucamp, Rob told her. Bucamp, said Willie Mae with disgust. She shook her head. One person in the world that don't need to be owning no tiger, and that's Bucamp. See, says Sistine, it's not right, is it? Just like you told Rob about your bird and how you had to let it go. A bird, said Willie Mae, is one thing. Tiger belonging to Bucamp is another. Tell Rob that he should unlock the cage and let him go, Sistine demanded. I ain't, said Willie Mae. You got to ask yourself what's going to happen to that tiger after you let him go. How's he going to live? Rob was flooded with sad relief. Willie Mae wasn't going to make him do it. He wasn't going to lose the tiger. Panthers live in the woods, argued Sistine. They survive. Used to, said Willie Mae. Don't no more. Sistine put her hands on her hips. You're not saying what you believe, she accused. You're not talking. That's 'cause I ain't, said Willie Mae. All I am is somebody speaking the truth. And the truth is, there ain't nothing you can do for this tiger except let it be. It's not right, said Sistine. Right ain't got nothing to do with it, muttered Willie Mae. Sometimes right don't count. I can't wait until my father comes to get me, said Sistine. You know what's right. He'll set this tiger free. Rob looked at Sistine. Your daddy ain't coming for you, he said softly, shaking his head, amazed at what he suddenly knew as the truth. My father is coming to get me, Sistine said through her tight lips. Nah, said Rob sadly, he ain't. He's a liar, like your mama said. You're a liar, said Sistine in a dark, cold voice. Her face was so white that it seemed to glow before him. And I hate you, she said to him. Everybody at school hates you too, even the teachers. You're a sissy. I hope I never see you again. She turned and walked away, and Rob stood and considered her words. He felt them on his skin like shards of broken glass. He was afraid to move. He was afraid of how deep they might go inside him. She didn't mean it, said Willie Mae. She don't mean none of what she says right now. Rob shrugged. He bent and scratched his legs as hard as he could. He scratched and scratched, digging his nails in deep, trying to get to the bottom of the itch that was always there. Stop it, Willie Mae told him. Rob looked up at her. Let me tell you something, she said. I would love to see this tiger rise up out of that cage. Yes, I would like to see him rise on up and attack Bucamp. Serve him right for keeping a wild animal locked up, putting you in the middle of this, giving you the keys to the cage. Come on, she grabbed hold of Rob's hand. Let's get on up out of here. As they walked back to the Kentucky Star, Rob thought about what Willie Mae had said about the tiger rising up. It reminded him of what she had said about the sadness needing to rise up. And when he thought about the two things together, the tiger and his sadness, the truth circled over and above him, and then came and landed lightly on his shoulder. He knew what he had to do. Chapter 26. He left Willie Mae in the motel and went down to the highway. Sistine, he shouted as he ran. Sistine, he screamed. And miraculously he saw her. Her orange dress with pink polka dots glowed in the horizon. Sistine Bailey. Hey, he shouted. Sistine, I've got something to tell you. I'm not talking to you, she shouted back. But she stopped. She turned around. She put her hands on her hips. He ran faster. I come to tell you about the tiger, he said when he caught up with her. What about him? I'm fixing to let him go, said Rob. Sistine squinted her eyes at him. You won't do it, she said. Yes, I will, he told her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys and held them in front of her, proudly, as he had conjured them up out of thin air, as if they had never existed before. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it for you. Hoo-wee! Somebody screamed. And Rob turned and saw Bucamp come speeding right towards them in his red Jeep. Oh, no, whispered Rob. Is it him? Sistine whispered. Rob nodded. Bucamp pulled over to the side of the road, spraying mud and water everywhere. You out getting your exercise, he hollered. Rob shrugged. Speak up, roared Bucamp. He got out of the Jeep and came towards them. Rob quickly pocketed the keys, his heart thumping once, loudly, as if it was cautioning him to keep quiet, and then it went back to its normal beat. "Well, looky here," said Beauchamp when he saw Sistine. "You out chasing girls? Is that it? Man after my own heart. This your girlfriend?" Beauchamp pounded Rob on the back. "No, sir," said Rob. He looked at Sistine. She was staring so hard at Beauchamp that Rob was afraid the man might burst into flames. "I got more goods for you," Beauchamp said. "I left him back at the motel with Ida Bell." "Yes, sir," said Rob. "What's your name, little thing?" Beauchamp said. Rob's heart gave another warning thump. Lord only knew what Sistine would say to Beauchamp, but Sistine, as always, surprised him. She smiled sweetly at Beauchamp. "Sissy," she said. "Well, that's a pretty name," said Beauchamp. "That's the kind of name worth running down the road after." He leaned over to Rob. "Remember what we got going. You're keeping your manly secrets, ain't you?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. Beauchamp winked. His toothpick was jiggling. "I got me some business in town," he said. He squeezed Rob's shoulder hard, and then took his hand away. "You and your girlfriend stay out of trouble now. You hear?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. Beauchamp swaggered back to the Jeep, and Rob and Sistine stood together and watched him get in it and roar down the highway. "He's afraid," said Sistine. "He's afraid of the tiger. That's why he's making you feed him." Rob nodded. That was another truth he had known without knowing it, the same as he had known that Sistine's father was not coming back. He must, he realized, know somewhere deep inside of him more things that he'd never dreamed of. "I'm sorry," he said, "what I said about your father. I'm sorry." "I don't want to talk about my father," said Sistine. "Maybe he is coming to get you." "He's not coming to get me." Sistine tossed her head. "And I don't care. It doesn't matter. What matters is the tiger. Let's go. Let's go set him free." Chapter 27. The first key slid into the lock so smoothly that it made Rob dizzy with amazement. It was going to be so easy to let the tiger go. "Hurry," Sistine said to him. "Hurry up. Get the other locks." He opened the second lock and the third, and then he took them off one by one, handing them to Sistine, who laid them on the ground. "Now open the door," she said. Rob's heart pounded and fluttered in his chest. "What if he eats us?" he asked. "He won't," said Sistine. "He'll leave us alone, out of gratitude. We're his emancipators." Rob flung the door wide. "Get out of the way," he shouted, and they both jumped back from the door and waited. But the tiger ignored them. He continued to pace back and forth in the cage, oblivious to the open door. "Go on," Rob said to him. "You're free," Sistine whispered. But the tiger didn't even look in the direction of the door. Sistine crept forward and grabbed hold of the cage. She shook it. "Get out," she screamed. "Come on," she said, turning to Rob. "Help me. Help me get him out." Rob grabbed hold of the fence and shook it. "Get," he said. The tiger stopped pacing and stared at them both, clinging like monkeys to the cage. "Go on," shouted Rob, suddenly furious. He shook the cage harder. He yelled. He put his head back and howled. He saw that the sky above them was thick with clouds, and that made him even angrier. He yelled louder. He shouted at the dark sky. He shook the cage as hard as he could. Sistine put her hand on his arm. "Shh," she said. "He's leaving. Watch." As they stared, the tiger stepped with grace and delicacy out of the cage. He put his nose up and sniffed. He took one tiny step and then another. Then he stopped, stood still. Sistine clapped her hands, and the tiger turned and looked back at them both, his eyes blazing. Then he started to run. He ran so fast, it looked to Rob like he was flying. His muscles moved like a river. It was hard to believe that a cage had ever contained him. It didn't seem possible. The tiger went leaping through the grass, moving further and further away from Rob and Sistine. He looked like the sun rising and setting again and again. They watched him go. Rob felt his own heart rising and falling, beating in time. Chapter 28. "Oh," said Sistine in a voice Rob loved. "See," she said, "that was the right thing. That was the right thing to do." Rob nodded, but in his mind he saw a flash of green. He remembered what happened to Crooked. "What?" said Sistine, turning to him. "What are you thinking about?" He shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "Robert!" The sound of his name came floating to them from the direction of the motel. "That's my dad," he said, confused. "That's my dad calling me." Then they heard Willie Mae. "Do Jesus!" she screamed, her voice high and wild. And then they heard the crack of a gun. They both stood still, stunned and silent. And when Willie Mae came running out from under the pine trees and saw them, she stopped. "Thank you, Jesus," she said, looking up at the sky. "2 whole children. Thank you. Come here," she said. She opened her arms. "Come here." Rob started to walk towards her. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong. He wanted to tell her that he didn't feel whole. But he didn't have the energy or the heart to say anything. All he could manage was putting one foot in front of the other. All he could do was keep walking towards Willie Mae. Willie Mae led them back, and when Rob saw the tiger on the ground and his father standing over it holding the rifle, he felt something rise up in him, an anger as big and powerful as the tiger. Bigger. "You killed him," he said to his father. "I had to," his father said. "That was my tiger," screamed Rob. "You killed him. You killed my tiger." He ran at his father and attacked him. He beat him with his fist. He kicked him, but his father stood like a wall. He held the gun up over his head and kept his eyes open and took each hit without blinking. And Rob saw that hitting wasn't going to be enough. So he did something he thought he would never do. He opened his suitcase. The words sprung out of it, coiled and explosive. "I wish it had been you," he screamed. "I wish it had been you that died. I hate you. You ain't the one I need. I need her. I need her." The world and everything in it seemed to stop moving. He stared at his father. His father stared at him. "Say her name," Rob screamed in the silence. "You say it." "Caroline," his father whispered, with the gun still held over his head and his eyes still open. And with that word, with that small sound of his mother's name, the world lurched back into motion. Like an old merry-go-round, it started to spin again, and his father put down his gun and pulled Rob to him. "Caroline," his father whispered. "Caroline, Caroline, Caroline." Rob buried his face in his father's shirt. It smelled like sweat and turpentine and green leaves. "I need her," Rob said. "I need her too, son," said his father, pulling Rob closer. "But we don't got her. Neither one of us." "What we got, all we got, is each other. And we got to learn to make do with that." "I ain't gonna cry," Rob said, shuddering his eyes, but the tears leaked out of them anyways. Then they came in a rush, and he couldn't stop. He cried from somewhere deep inside himself, from the place where his mother had been, the same place that the tiger had been and was gone from. Rob looked up and saw his father wiping tears from his eyes. All right, said his father, holding Rob tight. That's all right. You're okay, he said. When Rob finally looked up again, he saw Willie Mae holding Sistine like she was a baby, rocking her and saying, "Shh." Willie Mae stared back at him. Don't think you're going to start pounding on me now, she said. No, ma'am, said Rob. He wiped the back of his hand across his nose and slid out of his father's arms. I went and got your daddy, Willie Mae told Rob as she swayed back and forth, rocking Sistine. I figured out what you were going to do, and there ain't no telling what that tiger would have done once he got out of his cage. I went and got your daddy so he could save you. Yes, ma'am, said Rob. He went and stood over the open tiger's eyes. The bullet hole in his head was small and red. It didn't look big enough to kill him. Go ahead and touch him, said Sistine. Rob looked up. She was standing beside him. Her dress was twisted and wrinkled. Her eyes were red. Rob stared at her and she nodded. So he knelt and put out his hand and placed it on the tiger's head. He felt his tears rise up in him again. Sistine crouched down next to him. She put her hand on the tiger too. He was so pretty, she said. He was one of the prettiest things I'd ever seen. Rob nodded. We have to have a funeral for him, Sistine said. He's a fallen warrior. We have to bury him right. Rob sat down next to the tiger and ran his hand over the rough fur again and again until the tears traveled down his cheeks and dropped onto the ground. Chapter 29. Rob and his father worked with shovels to dig a hole that was deep enough and wide enough and dark enough to hold the tiger. The whole time it rained. We got to say some words over him, said Willie Mae, when the hole was done and the tiger was in it. Can't cover up nothing without saying some words. I'll say the poem, said Sistine. She folded her hands in front of her and looked down at the ground. Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forest of the night, she recited. Rob closed his eyes. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wing dare he aspire? To Rob, the words sounded like music, but better. His eyes filled with tears again. He worried that now that he had started crying, he might never stop. That's all I remember, Sistine said after a minute. There's more to it, but I can't remember it. You say something now, Rob. I don't got nothing to say, said Rob, except for I loved him. Well, what I got to say is I ain't had good experiences with animals in cages. She reached to her dress pocket, took out the wooden bird, bent down and laid it on top of the tiger. This ain't nothing, she said to the tiger, just a little bird to keep you company. She stepped back away from the grave. Rob's father cleared his throat. He hummed softly, and Rob thought he was going to sing, but instead he shook his head. I had to shoot him. I'm sorry, but I had to shoot him. For Rob. Rob leaned against his father, and it felt for a minute that his father leaned back. Then Rob picked up a shovel and started covering the tiger with dirt. As he filled the grave, something danced and flickered on his arm. Rob stared at it, wondering what it was. And then he recognized it. It was the sun, showing up for the first time since the funeral. I'm sorry I made you do it, Sistine said to Rob when they were alone. He wouldn't be dead if I hadn't made you do it. It's all right, Rob said. I ain't sorry about what I did. We can make a headstone for him, said Sistine. We can bring flowers and put them on his grave, fresh ones every day. She slipped her hand into his. I didn't mean what I said before about you being a sissy, and I don't hate you. You're my best friend. The whole way back to the Kentucky Star, Rob held on to Sistine's hand. He marveled at what a small hand it was, and how much comfort there was in holding on to it. He marveled, too, at how different he felt inside, how much lighter, as if he had set something heavy down and walked away from it, without bothering to look back. Chapter 30. That night, his father sang to Rob as he put the medicine on his legs. He sang the song about mining for gold, the one he used to sing with Rob's mother. When he was done with the medicine and the song, he cleared his throat and said, "Caroline loved that song." "Me too," Rob told him. "I like it too." His father stood up. "We're going to have to tell Bucamp that it was you that let the tiger out." "Yes, sir," said Rob. "I'll tell him I was the one that shot him, but you got to admit to letting him go." "Yes, sir," said Rob again. "I might could lose my job over it," his father said. "I know," Rob told him, but he wasn't afraid. He thought about Bucamp, shaking hands. Bucamp was the coward. He knew that now. "I thought I would tell him I could work for you to pay for what I done. You can offer him up something reasonable kind of solution, but it don't mean he'll go for it. There ain't no predicting Bucamp, other than to say he's going to be mad." Rob nodded. "And on Monday, I aim to call the principal and tell him you're going back to school. I ain't messing around with taking you to more doctors. You're going back, and that's that." "Yes, sir," said Rob. He didn't mind the thought of going back to school. School was where Sistine would be. His father cleared his throat. "It's hard for me to talk about your mama. I wouldn't never have believed that I could miss somebody the way I miss her. Saying her name pains me, but I'll say it for you, and I'll try on account of you." Rob looked at his father's hands. They were the hands that held the gun that shot the tiger. They were the hands that put the medicine on his legs. They were the hands that held him when he cried. They were complicated hands, Rob thought. "You want some macaroni and cheese for dinner?" his father asked, looking at Rob. "That sounds all right. Macaroni and cheese sounds really good." That night, Rob dreamed he and Sistine were standing at the grave of the tiger. They were watching and waiting. He didn't know for what, but when he saw a flutter of green wings, he understood. It was the wooden bird, only he wasn't made of wood, he was real. And he flew up out of the tiger's grave, and they chased him, laughing and bumping into each other. They tried to catch him, but they couldn't. The bird flew higher and higher until he disappeared into the sky that looked just like the Sistine ceiling. In his dream, Rob stood and stared up in the sky, admiring all the figures and colors, watching as the bird disappeared into them. "See," said Sistine in his dream, "I told you it was like fireworks." He woke up smiling, staring at the ceiling in the motel room. "Guess what?" his father called to him from outside. "What?" said Rob. "There ain't a cloud in the sky," said his father. "That's what." Rob nodded. He laid on his bed and watched the sun poke its way through his curtain. He thought about Sistine and the tiger he wanted to make her. He thought about what kind of wood he would use and how big he would make the tiger. He thought about how happy Sistine would be when she saw it. He lay in his bed and considered the future. And outside his window, the tiny neon Kentucky star rose and fell, competing bravely with the light of the morning sun. The end.